Nathan, this isn't funny, I said, holding the grocery bags with a grip tighter than necessary. His wife, Jessica, perched on the kitchen stool, painted her nails bright pink, completely ignoring me as she spoke. Either you serve me or you can leave, Nathan said, his tone sharp, impatient, and disturbingly final. I froze for a heartbeat, letting the words sink in. 8 months of paying the rent while they spent their money on dinners, movies, and shopping. Weeks of buying groceries, cleaning up, and quietly covering their mistakes. Nights I worked double shifts at the diner so Nathan could finish school without worrying about money. Every favor, every sacrifice, every unpaid debt of gratitude had led to this, an ultimatum that treated me like a servant in my own family. I set the bags down slowly, letting the plastic handles dig into my palms, the weight reminding me of every burden I'd carried silently. Jessica looked up, expecting me to plead, to argue, to beg, as I had in the past. Nathan's eyes searched mine for the familiar compliance he'd always relied on, but that Clara no longer existed. "I'll pack," I said quietly. My voice was calm, even deliberate. The surprise on their faces was immediate. Jessica's lips parted in a shocked "what?" and Nathan's eyes widened, caught between disbelief and frustration. No tears, no stammering apologies, no bargaining, just the decision I had been building towards silently for months. I turned toward the bedroom, each step deliberate, reclaiming the space that had always felt half theirs, half mine. The suitcase waited, the one I had packed for a short trip months ago, now repurposed to carry the life I was taking back into my own hands. Every item I tucked away, a pair of socks, my journals, the photograph of my late father, was a statement. I would no longer let my own family dictate my worth. Behind me, Nathan opened his mouth. Jessica's voice wavered, but I didn't look back. I walked steadily toward the door, leaving the apartment and the old version of myself behind, knowing this first step would set the tone for everything to come. I closed the bedroom door behind me and surveyed the small pile of belongings on the bed. Each item had a purpose, a memory, or a weight that felt both comforting and necessary. My journals, the few favorite clothes I still wore, and the photograph of my late father, all carefully selected. I folded each piece with precision, aware that this suitcase would carry more than things. It would carry the part of me I had reclaimed. As I zipped the bag, memory surfaced, unbidden. I remembered paying Nathan's tuition for community college, covering his textbooks and small fees when he thought he could manage on his part-time shifts alone. I remembered birthday gifts I had bought on a tight budget, dinners I had prepared when he came home from late classes, and the countless nights I had cleaned, cooked, or quietly fixed things he and Jessica had broken or neglected. Each memory carried both pride and a bitter ache. I had given so much, and yet my sacrifices had been treated as expected, not appreciated. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I opened my laptop to review my accounts. I traced every dollar I had spent for them, every automatic payment, every credit card charge. My mind mapped out what I could keep, what I could reclaim, and what I could cut off without consequence. For the first time in months, I felt control, not just over my finances, but over the life I would lead from this moment onward. I packed the last of my essentials and stood, suitcase in hand, feeling the weight and the freedom at once. The quiet in the apartment was different now, empty in a way that was mine. I took a deep breath and turned toward the door, ready to move into the next phase of my life, knowing the steps I would take from here would define me more than any sacrifice ever had. The apartment felt heavier than usual, each step toward the door echoing like a drumbeat of finality. Jessica was still perched on her stool, nails half-painted, her lips curling in a mix of disbelief and irritation. Nathan hovered nearby, his face pale and rigid, like he hadn't anticipated the outcome of his own words. I ignored both of them, the weight of my suitcase grounding me. Each step was a declaration I didn't need to voice. I paused briefly at the threshold, glancing back just enough to see the surprise flicker across their faces. I had expected anger, maybe even pleading. What I found instead was confusion and frustration, a quiet that carried its own tension. For months, I had internalized their expectations, convinced that compliance was the only way to keep peace. Now, stepping out, I realized peace could only exist if I defined it on my own terms. The hallways smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and lingering perfume, but I didn't notice. Each footfall carried a strange mixture of relief and resolve. I didn't look at the elevator or the windows of neighboring apartments. The world outside was both unknown and inviting. Every step away from the apartment was a step toward clarity. For the first time in months, I felt the air shift around me, a lightness in my chest that contradicted the tension I had carried for so long. I reached the lobby, leaving the suitcases by the front desk momentarily, and signed for my temporary rental keys. The clerk looked at me with a polite smile, oblivious to the storm I had left behind. I tucked the keys into my pocket and felt a spark of empowerment. The apartment, the ultimatums, the months of silent servitude, they were behind me, confined to memory and to lessons learned. As I stepped outside, the crisp air of early evening filled my lungs. The streets of Millfield stretched ahead, familiar yet unclaimed territory for me now. Each step on the sidewalk solidified the decision I had made, my life, my terms, my dignity. I didn't turn back, not even once. With my suitcase rolling beside me, I walked toward the car I had parked 2 blocks away, the quiet hum of the engine welcoming me to the next phase where freedom would be tested and the consequences of my choice would begin to unfold. The temporary rental was modest, a 1-bedroom apartment on the edge of Millfield, but it felt like the first place that truly belonged to me. I carried my suitcase inside, closing the door behind me and letting the quiet settle. For the first time in months, the space wasn't shared or dictated by anyone else's expectations. The furniture was simple, the walls bare, but the emptiness was liberating rather than oppressive. I unpacked slowly, placing each item carefully. My journals went on the small shelf by the window. Clothes in the closet I could now call my own, and the photograph of my late father took its place on the nightstand. I paused often, letting the reality sink in. This was mine, my routines, my decisions, my life. No ultimatums, no unsolicited orders, no lurking expectations of obedience. After settling in, I pulled out my laptop and began reviewing my finances. Months of automatic payments, rent, utilities, and groceries had left clear traces in my accounts. I carefully mapped out what had gone out, what I could reclaim, and what needed to be frozen or canceled. Each click and entry reinforced the control I had regained, a stark contrast to the helplessness I had felt under Nathan and Jessica's demands. The apartment, modest as it was, became a command center of sorts, organized, calm, and focused. I felt the beginnings of clarity, a blueprint for independence forming piece by piece. By the time the evening settled in, I had established simple routines: a small dinner at the table, a cup of tea by the window, time to organize my thoughts and my money. I sat back, letting the stillness wash over me, knowing the challenges ahead would test the resolve I had finally reclaimed. But for the first time in months, I felt prepared. I sat at the small kitchen table in my rental, laptop open, scanning through my bank statements with a rising sense of disbelief. Charges I hadn't authorized, returns I hadn't requested, purchases that didn't make sense. Jessica's pattern emerged clearly. Each line item was a small betrayal. Each return, a deliberate act of taking advantage. She hadn't been careless or desperate. She had been calculating, using my resources as though they were her own. I pulled out the receipts I had saved from months past, comparing them to the statements. There it was, expensive cosmetics returned for cash, items I had purchased with my own funds, now unaccounted for. A quick check of store policies confirmed what I feared. These returns had been structured to maximize the cash she could take without triggering alerts. My stomach churned at the realization that this had been happening under my roof while I had been providing for them. I created a folder on my laptop, labeling it clearly, Jessica Warner Evidence. Each receipt, each screenshot, each policy document went in. I copied emails and text messages where she had casually asked for access to my cards or accounts. The pattern was unmistakable. I had proof enough to show a consistent history of deception. The more I documented, the clearer my next steps became. I drafted a plan, stop all automatic payments to Nathan's apartment, remove them from shared phone lines, and block any further access to my credit cards. I would contact the police to report fraudulent use and ensure the paper trail was official. My control over the situation was growing, and with it, a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt in months. I leaned back in my chair, eyes tracing the evidence I had collected. Each detail reinforced that I was no longer at their mercy. The realization settled in fully. Reclaiming my finances was only part of the battle. Ensuring they faced the consequences of their actions would require careful strategy, legal awareness, and patience. I shut the laptop and stood, suitcase and evidence in hand, ready to move forward with the next steps that would secure both my independence and the justice that had been overdue. The morning light spilled into the apartment as I logged into my online accounts. Each keystroke was deliberate and measured. I stopped the automatic rent payment to Nathan's apartment, removed their numbers from my shared phone plan, and blocked the credit cards they had been using. Within hours, the consequences of my decisions rippled back. Nathan called repeatedly, his voice rising with confusion and anger. Jessica left urgent messages, alternating between threats and pleas, each one confirming the chaos I had anticipated. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reviewed the logs, confirmed each change, and ensured all documentation was accurate, calm, and methodical. I became the architect of the disruption that had long been brewing beneath the surface. When I finally picked up the phone, I spoke firmly, refusing to justify myself or plead for understanding. The panic in their voices was unmistakable, a stark contrast to the calm I maintained. They had assumed compliance, and the sudden assertion of my boundaries left them unmoored. I spent the day contacting the bank to confirm all adjustments, double-checking the cancellations and freezes. Each confirmation email was a reminder that control had shifted, that my autonomy was no longer negotiable. I documented every interaction, preparing for the potential fallout that would inevitably follow. By evening, the apartment felt quiet again. Though the tension lingered in the unanswered calls and unread messages, the plan was in motion, and the first tangible consequences of their long-standing disregard were unfolding. I reviewed the day's actions one last time, knowing the next step would require precision, vigilance, and careful execution to ensure the foundation I had rebuilt would hold against whatever resistance Nathan and Jessica attempted next. The next morning, I contacted the Millfield Police Department and explained Jessica's escalating behavior. I detailed the unauthorized credit card charges, the aggressive messages, and the intimidation tactics she had used in the apartment complex. Officer Martinez listened carefully, asking for documentation and confirming the pattern of harassment. I handed over the receipts, statements, and logs I had compiled, each one a clear record of deliberate manipulation and theft. With their guidance, I filed for a restraining order. The process was methodical, but the act itself carried a weight of empowerment I hadn't felt before. For months, I had tolerated fear and control. Now, the law was on my side. The official paperwork stipulated that Jessica could not come within 300 feet of me or my temporary residence, with immediate legal consequences if she violated it. I followed up with the bank, ensuring that all adjustments to accounts and cards were documented, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Each confirmation strengthened my position, transforming months of silent endurance into a tangible shield of protection. Word of the action spread quickly through the small community. Neighbors who had witnessed her attitude and heard her confrontations began to approach me with support and questions. Their recognition of the unfairness validated my decision and reinforced the consequences for Nathan and Jessica. Even without confrontation, the combination of legal authority and community awareness began to shift the balance of power. By evening, the restraining order was in effect, the documentation secured, and the first public acknowledgement of my autonomy established. The initial panic from Nathan and Jessica had been replaced by a cautious uncertainty. I sat at the table, reviewing everything once more. The evidence was organized, the authorities informed, and the foundation laid for the next steps that would fully reclaim the control I had lost for so long. Nathan showed up at the apartment the next morning, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. He hadn't expected the restraining order to be filed so quickly, nor had he anticipated that I would act with such deliberate calm. I met him in the small living room, suitcase by my side, evidence and documentation neatly organized on the table. "Clara, this has gone too far," he said, voice tight with anger. "We can work this out. You don't have to do this." I looked at him steadily. "You don't get to decide anymore. I have done everything I could to support you, and every effort was treated as an expectation, not appreciation. This is the consequence of your choices." His eyes flicked toward Jessica, who lingered at the doorway, her usual confidence shaken. The fire in her stance faltered as she realized that her manipulation and intimidation had no effect on me. She opened her mouth, likely to argue, but the legal documentation and the calm in my voice left her unsure, momentarily speechless. Nathan's face changed as he absorbed my words. The frustration was still there, but beneath it, a trace of understanding began to appear. I didn't realize," he started, voice faltering. "I thought you'd always." "I did what I had to," I said. "For months, I tolerated disrespect and control. I enabled your and Jessica's behavior because I cared, but enabling only teaches entitlement. I won't do it anymore." The room felt heavier in that silence, the tension suspended between accountability and denial. Nathan swallowed, shifting uncomfortably, recognizing for the first time the weight of his misjudgment. Jessica's attempts to regain control were met with my unwavering gaze, and the power dynamic had shifted entirely. I gathered my evidence, ensuring every step was organized and verifiable, not for intimidation, but to protect myself and assert what was right. Nathan's expression softened, a flicker of regret in his eyes, and I knew he was beginning to grasp the consequences of his actions. I left the apartment with my suitcase, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows, fully aware that the next steps would solidify the changes I had set in motion and shape the course of my independence. The apartment felt like home for the first time since I had arrived. I arranged my belongings with care, each item in its place, creating a space that was mine entirely. The weight of months of control and expectation had lifted, replaced by a quiet clarity. I established routines, waking early to review my finances, preparing my meals, and dedicating time to small projects I had long postponed. I contacted the bank one last time to ensure all unauthorized charges were blocked and reviewed statements for any lingering anomalies. Each confirmation reinforced my sense of security and autonomy. The boundaries I had set were firm but fair, protecting me without isolating me from the people I still cared about. Nathan reached out cautiously, his tone measured, tentative. He acknowledged the impact of his actions and began to express a willingness to understand my perspective. I listened, responding honestly about my feelings and the consequences of their behavior. Trust had been broken, and I was clear that it would not be rebuilt overnight. But his acknowledgement was a necessary first step. I also reflected on my own resilience, recognizing that my sense of self had been obscured by years of accommodation. Now, each decision I made, financial, emotional, or personal, was deliberate, a reminder of the power I held over my own life. I began to feel a pride that had nothing to do with approval from others, an independence that carried with it both responsibility and freedom. By evening, I sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in hand, reviewing notes and planning the next steps to fully secure my independence. I understood that maintaining these boundaries and fostering honesty would be an ongoing process, but I felt prepared for the challenges ahead. The foundation I had built was solid, and the next phase of reclaiming my life was ready to begin. Nathan approached me one afternoon with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. He admitted, without hesitation, the weight of my sacrifices and the ways he and Jessica had taken my patience and generosity for granted. His acknowledgement was genuine, the first step toward accountability, and it carried a sense of relief I hadn't anticipated. Jessica left town shortly after, her departure quiet and without confrontation. The tension that had dominated the past months began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of closure. My former apartment, once a source of conflict, was repurposed as community housing for women in need, a tangible reminder that my choices could create positive impact beyond my own life. I settled into a steady routine, one shaped by my priorities alone: mornings spent reviewing finances and planning the day, afternoons dedicated to personal projects, evenings to quiet reflection, and simple meals I prepared for myself. Independence no longer felt like a burden, but a reaffirmation of control and dignity. The justice I had carved out was not vengeful, but deliberate, a preservation of self-respect and moral clarity. Nathan's acknowledgement, combined with the tangible consequences for Jessica, confirmed that boundaries could be effective without destroying relationships entirely. As I closed my laptop and glanced around the apartment, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. I had reclaimed my life, protected my well-being, and established a framework for trust and accountability that would guide the future, leaving the past firmly behind.